presence and His praise. It is the end of the royal psalms, and we've talked about that in the course of our study, that there's a section of the psalms that are called royal psalms. They are psalms that deal with the idea of the coming king and rejoicing over the king. Many would believe that these psalms are messianic in nature, and they do seem to have that tone, that tenor to them. And so we want to study it with that in the background of our minds. Notice in Psalm 100, as we read it together, it says, "Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before His presence with singing. Know ye that the Lord, He is God. It is He that hath made us, and not we ourselves. We are His people, and the sheep of His pasture. Enter into His gates with thanksgiving, and into His courts with praise. Be thankful unto Him, and bless His name. For the Lord is good, His mercy is everlasting, and His truth endureth to all generations." It's just 5 verses, but they are rich verses, and it will take us the course of our time tonight to be able to deal with them. As we take a look at this psalm, you can see a messianic overtone to this psalm. You may want to look at verse 1, that he refers to all ye lands. And so we're talking about a time where all people will have the opportunity to be involved in this salvation. And certainly we think of the New Testament, we think of the New Covenant, we think of the Great Commission, where the gospel is going into all the world, where everyone is going to have the opportunity to enter in and to be a part of the spiritual body of Christ. In the Old Testament, of course, the Jews were to be a light to the Gentiles, and there were some Gentiles who came to know God, but there were many Gentiles who had been given up because of their sinfulness, because of their transgression, because of their failure to do what God wanted them to do. They were so far away from salvation. As we move to the New Testament, of course, there's going to be the opportunity for them to be able to enter in a way that has not been theirs up until that time. We'll talk about that maybe as we move deeper into the psalm even tonight. And so we see that in verse 1, where we have the reference to all ye lands. We also have that idea in verse 3 when we start reading about God's people described as sheep and sheep in His pasture. And of course that brings to us the image of Jesus, the Good Shepherd in John chapter 10, and the care that He gives as well to His sheep. Now, as we look at this psalm, we want to divide it up in these 3 sections that we've outlined. His people, His presence, and His praise. And the emphasis on each of these is on His. Understanding that this psalm is from beginning to end. This psalm is about God. And it is about what God has done for us as His people. Let's start out by talking about the fact that we are, in fact, His people. Take a look at the psalm and what the psalm has to say about us. What it has to say about the people. There's a number of emphasis within this psalm on that very idea. But verse 3 especially. Know ye that the Lord, He is God. It is He that hath made us, and not we ourselves. We are His people, and the sheep of His pasture. And so we see the emphasis in this verse, as well as the other verses, on us and who we are and who we're supposed to be. That we are supposed to be His people. That we're supposed to be His sheep. That we belong to Him. Now this is found in 3 ways within the psalm. First of all, it is found in the fact that He is Lord and we are servants. Take a look at verse 1. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands. And through these verses, we're going to have several references to the fact that He is the Lord, that He is the ruler, He is the one that is in charge, and we are the people, we are the servants of His rule. Notice in verse 2, serve the Lord with gladness. Come before His presence with singing. We are to serve the Lord. He is the Lord. He's the ruler. He's the master. And we are in the position of servant. We need to understand that. And certainly when we talk about this matter of worship, we have to understand that as we come into His presence, we must be mindful of the fact that He is the Lord. and that we are the servants. Worship is not set up according to our likes or our dislikes. It is not based on what we want, but rather it is based on what He wants. He is the Lord, and we are the servants within His kingdom. Now, notice as well, as we move down through here, that not only is He the Lord and we are His servants, but we see that He is the Creator and that we are the creation. In verse 3, know ye that the Lord, He is God. It is He that hath made us. God is the Creator. God is the one that made us. We were not made by chance. We were not made by accident. We were not created by blind evolution. We were not created by any of those processes, but rather we were created by God. God is the Creator. He is the one that made us, and not we ourselves. Not only does this deal with the fact that atheism is false, and evolution is false, but it deals with the fact that humanism is false. Because we didn't make ourselves. Man is not the ultimate judge or rule or guide or determiner of everything. But rather God is the one that made us. He is the Creator, we are the creation. And when we recognize the fact that when we come into worship that He is the Creator and we are the creation, again it emphasizes the fact that worship is not about our likes or our dislikes. It's not about what we want, but rather it's about what He wants. He is in the position of authority over us, and we must recognize that. That's an important point to be made. But notice as well, according to verse 3, that He is the shepherd and we are the sheep. It says in this passage, we are His people and the sheep of His pasture. It's His pasture. He is the shepherd. We are the sheep. Again, this is a position of authority. It is a position where He has authority over us. He is the shepherd. He is the one that determines what's best for the flock. He is the one that commands the sheep to do what He wants them to do. It is not the sheep's position to say, but I want to do this, or but I like this, or but I think this. That's not within the sheep's role to do that. It is within the sheep's responsibility to submit to Him as the shepherd. He is the shepherd. We are the sheep. And so our goal is to obey Him. Our goal is to listen to Him and do what He would have us to do. And so we see this emphasis in this psalm. We see this authority structure that is set up with Him as the Lord and us as the servant. With Him as the Creator and us as the creation. With Him as the shepherd and us as the sheep. And so when we come into worship with that understanding that we are His people, that we belong to Him as the servants, as the creation, as the sheep. And He's in a position of authority over us. That's extremely important because it seems to me that many people today forget that. Many people reverse those roles. It is as if the worshiper is the Creator. It is as if the worshiper is the Lord. It is as if the worshiper is the shepherd. It's the worshiper that calls the shots. It's the worshiper determines what he's going to do or not going to do. And that's far into this psalm. It's far into the attitude that's contained within this psalm, and that should be true of us as well. But now let's talk about the second point, and that is His presence. His presence. That's emphasized throughout this psalm. But this psalm especially deals with the idea of coming into His presence. It deals with the idea of approaching God. Now that's a concept that we may take for granted, but it was not something that the Old Testament worshiper took for granted. The average Israelite in the Old Testament could not approach God in the sense that we can approach God. We think about the average Israelite being able to enter in through the gates of the temple and come into the outer court. But that was as far as he could come, the outer court. There was the laver there. There were the reminders there that you had to be clean, that you had to be purified in order to go any further than that. And yet the average Hebrew could not do that. The average Hebrew remained on the outside, remained in the outer court. Now the priest was allowed to approach further. But of course there had to be that cleansing that took place that would enable him to be able to enter further. But even as they entered in, there was a barrier where they could go no further. There was a barrier that kept them from being able to approach as close as they might want to approach. They could approach closer than the people, and yet still they were barred from being in the very presence of God. Then there was the high priest, who was allowed to enter into the innermost holy place, the most holy place, but he was only allowed to do that once a year. It was not free access all the time, but rather it was very limited access for one person once a year. Now, they understood this process of approaching God and being able to get so close to God and not any closer, get so close to God and not any closer, and even when they were able to enter into that most holy place, it was very limited access. Now, when we think about the parallel, or the comparison to our situation, we are able to enter in. We're able, according to New Testament terminology, to draw nigh unto God. We all are priests, according to 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9, and so we're able to enter in. We're able to, through our high priest, to have access into the wonderful presence of Almighty God. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about His presence within this psalm, and there's a great deal of emphasis on it. Notice in verse 2, it says, "Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before His presence with singing." His presence there can be translated as literally, come before His face with singing. It is the idea of drawing into a very, very close relationship with God. We have the privilege of doing that in New Testament worship. We have the privilege of drawing into the presence of God. We have the opportunity, if you will, of approaching the face of God, in the sense that we have that kind of intimate relationship with God. We know that the Bible teaches no man has seen God at any time. We know the consequences of looking upon God, and yet we're granted the greatest of access to the throne of God in worship. In Psalm 100 in verse 4, it says, "Enter into His gates with thanksgiving, and into His courts with praise." Notice the emphasis on His gates, His courts. This belongs to God. God grants us the privilege of being able to come into His presence, of being able to enter into His gates, of being able to enter into His courts. God grants us the privilege of being able to do that. And I don't know that we fully appreciate or understand what a great privilege that is. Some of you, maybe you have a favorite musician, and you were granted backstage access, where you were allowed to go into areas where other people couldn't go. Maybe you were even allowed to go back and go into this star's dressing room. Maybe you're able to go in and sit down and visit with them, or shake their hand, or get their autograph, or in some other way to have this access. How did that make you feel? Did you not feel special? Was that not, did you not consider that a great honor to be able to have that kind of access to a person who had risen to that level? Maybe it's a sports star, and maybe you got the opportunity of going back into the locker room and shaking someone's hand or visiting with someone in that way. Did you not feel special? Was not some great honor to be able to do that? Go backstage and meet an actor or an actress or someone else. But you know, when all of that is said and done, who are those people? Just men. Just women. People of like passions, as we talked about Sunday, right? Just people like we are. Oh, they may have a beautiful voice, or they may have a lot of skill as an athlete or as an actor or in some other way, but they're just men. We are granted the opportunity of having great access to the ruler of all men, to the Creator of the world, to the good shepherd who keeps the sheep. We are allowed through worship to be able to have access into His presence, to come into His gates, to come into His courts. That's access that most people cannot even imagine. I heard a story about a little boy who was in England, and he wanted to go see the king. And so he goes and he gets to the gates, and there are soldiers at the gates, and there are policemen at the gates, and they engage the little boy, and the little boy explains, I'm here to see the king. And they explain to him, son, I'm sorry, but you don't have access to the king. You're not going to be allowed to come in and see the king. And while they were explaining that to the little boy, there was a man who walked up. And that man heard the young man's request, and so he grabbed the boy by the arm and he said, come with me. And he turned, and the policemen parted, and the soldiers parted, and the gates opened, and he was allowed to enter in and meet the king. Do you know why? Because this man was the prince. This man was the son of the king. This son had access to the king. And through this son, this young boy had access to the king. Now the parallel to us is simple, isn't it? We have access to the throne of God. We have access to God through God's Son. Because of God's Son and because of our relationship with His Son, we are able to enter in a way that we never could without Him. What would be barred to us without Him is open to us because of Him. We have access to the throne of God. And so we enter into His presence. We come into His gates. We enter into His courts. And what a great honor that is. Now, when we think about that, you may remember in the book of Esther that there is a queen. Of course, Esther becomes queen. And Esther wants to go in before the king. I don't know if she wants to. She's put in the position of having to go in before the king and make a petition on part of her people. And so she appears on the outside, uninvited, unannounced, which is a very serious thing to do in the Persian court. But she's there, and she wants access to the king. Now, the king has loved her in the past. There's no question about her. He selected her out of all the beautiful women in Persia. She was the one he picked. And so there's no doubt that she's had his eye in the past. But the book of Esther tells us that it's been some days before the king has called for her. And so it may be that he's fallen out of infatuation with her. It may be that he's cast his eye on someone else. It may be for some reason he's tired of her. Those ancient monarchs could be like that. But here's Esther, desiring entrance into the presence of the king. And if the king doesn't hold out his scepter, then the person who is entering is considered to be a threat to the throne, and that person's killed. But the king holds out the scepter, and Esther kisses that scepter. That scepter represents her life, and the king has spared her life. She's able to make the petition of the king. But Esther entering into that court in the Old Testament is a picture that we need to realize as well. In worship, we are entering into the presence of God. We're entering into the court of God. Now, God's not a pagan monarch, and He's certainly not a monarch that likes us one minute and doesn't like us the next minute. He isn't fickle. He isn't vain. He isn't any of those things that probably were true of the king of Persia. But He is powerful. And He does have the power of life and of death within His hands. And there is a certain reverence that goes with entering into His courts. There's a seriousness to what we're doing when it comes into worship. We need to understand that when we come into worship, that is a very, very serious thing. All you have to do is look at the examples through the Bible of what happened to people when they didn't enter into worship in the right way. And you understand that this is a very serious matter. Cain, Nadab, and Abihu. On and on, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Go on and on and on of various examples of individuals approaching God, but not approaching God in the right way, and they're being rejected, they're being smitten or killed as a result of that, of not showing the proper honor and respect and obedient submission to God, suffering as a result of that. And so it's a very serious matter when we come into the presence of God that we acknowledge who God is and who we are, and that we approach God with that understanding. Now the difference is this. In the Old Testament, if you approach God in a way other than the appointed way, many times the penalty for that was immediate. Nadab and Abihu offered strange fire, and the penalty was immediate. There went out fire from the Lord and devoured them. Today, the penalty is not immediate. You're not going to walk forward and offer to God that in worship which He has not approved of or not authorized, and fire or lightning or something else come from heaven and immediately strike you down. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages in the system that we live in. The advantage in the system that we live in is that we might get more than one chance. Wasn't always true in the Old Testament. Offer strange fire, you die. That's it. There's no more chances, no more opportunities. It's done. For other people, they learn from it, they don't do it. There are additional chances for them, but not for you. And so the advantage today is that there may yet be time for you to turn from that, to realize the error of what you're doing, to not do it again, to do it right the next time. But the disadvantage is this. The disadvantage is because you do it wrong one time and you get by with it, because you do it wrong one time and nothing happens to you immediately, there's the temptation to continue to do it the wrong way. There's the temptation to never get it right. There's the temptation to never make the changes that you need to make. That's the disadvantage to the system that we live in. We have to be aware of that. And we have to learn from the Old Testament. It was written for our learning that we might learn from it. Because the fact of the matter is, we may offer false worship to God 1,000 times and there never be an immediate penalty for those actions. But does that mean that there never will be a penalty for those actions? Does that mean that there never will be any consequences for what we've done? Doesn't mean that at all. Because there is a judgment day coming. There is an accounting day that is coming. And we will have to give an account of ourselves before God. There is a day when we'll be judged for that. Even if the penalty under the system that we live is not immediate, it does not mean that that penalty is not coming. So we have to be aware of that as we enter into His presence. But now let's think about His praise. There are a number of statements within this psalm that deal with the praise that is due God. We're told the reasons why God do these things. But notice all the with statements in this psalm. Notice in verse 2, serve the Lord with gladness. This has to do with praise. This has to do with the way that we approach God. We approach God with gladness. Do you remember in the book of Nehemiah that Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king? And Nehemiah was heartbroken over the condition of Jerusalem, over the condition of his people. He knew the walls were broken down. He knew that the sepulchres were desecrated. He knew the terrible condition of those that were still back in that land. And Nehemiah was heartbroken over that. We sing the song, children's song, if you're happy and you know it, your face will surely show it. But the opposite's true as well, right? If you're not happy, eventually your face will show that too. You can't hide that forever. Eventually it will come out. The day came in Nehemiah chapter 2 where that came out from Nehemiah. Now it was the requirement of those who served the king that they be happy. The king didn't want sad people in his presence. He didn't want people with frowns on their faces, people with downcast looks serving him. No, it was considered to be a great honor to serve the king. It was a great privilege to have this job of all jobs in the land. And so if you served the king, you were supposed to serve him with joy. There came the occasion when Nehemiah was serving the king and his sadness came out. And the king asked him about it. The Bible tells us that Nehemiah became very afraid. Because Nehemiah knew what happened if you were in the king's presence and you weren't happy. Now I want you to understand that when we come into the presence of God, God is not a fickle human ruler. He's not like the king that Nehemiah was serving. He's not like the king that Esther was serving, or these other ancient monarchs who were just fickle. Liked you one day, didn't like you the next day. God isn't like that. I don't want to give that impression of Him. But if it is the requirement of earthly rulers that when you enter into their presence, you ought to be joyful and you ought to be happy and you ought to be thankful, then certainly it ought to be something that we understand that when we approach God, when we come into His presence, if a man is deserving of that, certainly God is deserving of that. If a man deserves somebody that's happy to be serving Him, if a man deserves somebody who's thankful and grateful for the position that he has, then certainly God is deserving of that. And when we come into His presence, we ought to come into His presence with, verse 2, with gladness. We ought to serve Him with gladness. But some of us serve God in the same way that the elder brother served the father. He served the Father. There's no question about it. You read the parable that Jesus told, and He serves the Father. He doesn't go into the far country. He doesn't waste His living with riotous living. He doesn't make this demand of the Father. He doesn't do the things that the younger brother does. Even when the younger brother comes home, where is the elder brother? What is he doing? He's in the field working. He's in the field serving. This elder brother worked for the father. This other elder brother did what his father asked him to do. But what about his attitude? What about his heart? His heart was as far from the Father as it could be. He was at home, but in spirit he was in the far country. He was not where he wanted to be. He was not doing what he wanted to do. He was serving, but there was no joy. There was no gladness. There was no thankfulness in his service. Now that describes a lot of people, I'm afraid today, who they come to the services of the church, but they come more out of duty than out of delight. They're here because they feel like they have to be here, rather than because they want to be here. They sing because they know that they're supposed to sing, but they don't sing because there's joy in their heart or because they are so thankful for what God's given to them. They give because it's a duty to give, but they don't give cheerfully. They don't give because they want to give. They don't give because they're so thankful for all that God's given to them. No, it's a duty, but not a delight. This psalm is talking about the fact that we're His people. We understand what our position is in relation to Him. We understand that we're in His presence. And we understand that as a result of being in His presence, there are certain attitudes that are required of us. And one of those attitudes is gladness. We serve Him not out of duty. We serve Him out of gladness. We serve Him because we want to. Now, think about this and think about how easy it is. Sometimes you get a new job. And when you get that job, you're just so happy to have it. It's the best job in all the world. I get to do this job. I get to wait on the president. Or I get to take care of this team. Or I get to do this or I get to do that. And we're excited about it. It's a great job. But what tends to happen over time? Oh, the newness wears off, right? Suddenly, that which started out as a delight, as an honor, I can't believe I have this job, to a duty and maybe even to drudgery, where we just have to do it, not something we want to do. Sometimes we become Christians and we're so thankful. I've been saved from my sins. My sins have been taken away. I'm able to pray to God. I'm now able to have this relationship with God. What a joy, what a privilege it is. But over the course of time, we lose that. And it becomes, I have to go to the services. I have to give. I have to sing. I have to do this. Not that I want to. This psalm talks about serving with gladness. But notice also in verse 2, it says, come before His presence with singing. So there's with gladness. Now there's with singing. Notice the gladness comes before the singing. James would say in James chapter 5, is any merry, let him do what? Let him sing. You see, the merriment comes before the singing. The gladness comes before the singing. If you're going to have a person who's singing, you've got to begin with a merry heart. You've got to begin with a person who's glad, who's joyous in their salvation. Then singing pours forth naturally from that. But notice as we continue some other things that are said. Notice in verse 4, enter into His courts with thanksgiving. With thanksgiving. With gladness, with singing, and now with thanksgiving. And into His courts with praise. Notice gladness, singing, thanksgiving, praise. That's how we enter into His courts. We're not supposed to come before God empty-handed. But the things that God requires of us when we come before His presence are things that all of us can bring. Now, God's always made it possible for men to worship Him, for men to make sacrifices to Him. He made it possible for the rich, but He also made it possible for the poor. You remember, the parents of Jesus were poor. And so they could not offer the lamb. They had to offer the turtle doves. That was the sacrifice of the poor rather than the sacrifice of the rich. But God made it possible for them to approach Him and make an offering, even though they didn't have very much. Even a poor man could come up with enough to have the turtle doves to make that kind of offering. Now, the point that I'm making is this. The things that God requires of us in worship are things that all of us can give, because they are essentially giving ourselves. They're not material things that might be, and probably not because of the country we live in and because of the situation we're in, but they are not gifts that are beyond our ability to give. God says, I want you to give gladness. I want you to give singing. I want you to give thanksgiving. I want you to give praise. Now those four things, any person here tonight can give those things. I don't know what your bank account is. I don't know what your job is. I don't know what kind of car you're driving, what kind of clothes you're wearing. I don't know anything about those things. But I know that those four things are within your power to give. You can give them tonight. You can offer them as gifts to God tonight. Not a person here is so poor that they cannot give those things. Now, they may not give those things. They may not have come with a glad heart. They may not have come with thanksgiving. They may not have come with singing. They may not have come with any of those things tonight. But those are things that every one of us could have brought tonight, had we so desired and offered them to God. That's the good God that we serve. That's the opportunity that we have. Now, there are some reasons that we're told within the psalm as to why we should give God those things. Notice, first of all, in verse 3, know ye that the Lord, He is God. We ought to give them because He's God. And simply the fact that He is God makes Him deserving of these things. He's God, we're not. Because He's God, He's deserving of these things. Notice as well, He that hath made us. He's deserving of these things not only because He's God, He's deserving of these things because He made us. But notice as well in verse 5, for the Lord is good. He's deserving of these things because He's not only God, but He is good. That's His nature. His mercy is everlasting. He's deserving of these things because He's merciful and has been merciful to us. He's deserving of these things because of His truth and the fact that His truth endureth. It has lasted to all generations. God is deserving of all of these things because of who He is, because of what He's done, because of what He continues to do on our behalf. He's deserving of these things within our lives. Now, Psalm 100 closes out this section of royal psalms, and it does it in a very beautiful way in reminding us of some things that are extremely important. Reminding us of who we are and of who He is, of our relationship to Him. Reminding Him that in worship we come into His presence, and there's a seriousness connected with coming into His presence. And then finally reminding us of the praise, of the thanks, of the adoration, of the gladness that ought to be ours as we come into His presence. This is an Old Testament psalm, but I think you will agree it has New Testament implications, doesn't it? It has a lot to say about us today. It has a lot to say about our worship. Now, if anything, the psalmist who's outlining these things here, he's living in the Mosaic dispensation. Three dispensations: patriarchal, mosaical, Christian dispensation. Patriarchal, we sometimes call that starlight. We call the mosaical moonlight. We call the Christian sunlight, because with each passing dispensation, there's more and more light that's available to us. They had only the Old Testament revelation. We have the Old Testament plus the New Testament. We have the complete revelation of God. Now, these are some things that the psalmist could see with the light that he had, with the light that he had been given. We have been given so much more light. We have been given so much of a greater privilege than what he had. Remember, his access was limited. Even if this psalm was a psalm of David, David being king, David's access was limited, even as a king. A king couldn't enter into the most holy place. A king couldn't even enter into the holy place. A king was in the position of everyone else, being on the outer court. It's as close as he could get. We are in the position of being priest, of being able to enter in. And through our high priest, to being able to have access to the very presence of God. I thank you so much for your attention tonight.